Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Brittany, and like I mentioned, I recently moved out to Denver to be an instructor at Turing School of Software and Design. So I've been teaching front-end web application development for about 2 years now. And one of the things that we really emphasize with our students is that they should be using proper vocabulary and articulating themselves appropriately when they're talking about their code. Our students had a tendency to have a block of code and they would describe it by saying things like, oh, well, you know, this thing calls this over here, and then that moves over here, and this thing calls this and sends this information over there. And we're like, what? I don't understand what you're saying. So we were teaching them all the proper terms to use and all the terms that they should avoid as well. And in doing so, I started to realize that we had a lot of bizarre, jargony words in our industry that we use. Words that I wouldn't normally think twice about. My students would either laugh at or ask me questions about. And I realized I didn't know how to explain some of them. So that prompted me to do a little bit of research and look into some of the terminology that we use when we're talking about code and while we're programming, okay? So I made a tiny list of words that I'm going to talk about today with all of you. Our first example is the term bug. And this is one of the most classic origin stories that we have in programming. Some of you might already be familiar with it, but for those of you who aren't, the term bug was popularized in the 1940s by a Harvard University technical team. They found an actual moth in one of their machines that was causing it to malfunction. So noted computer scientist Grace Hopper removed that moth and taped it to a log, a bug log, if you will, with the caption, "First actual case of bug being found." Okay, so this wasn't the very first instance of that term being used in programming. The phrase bugs in a computer had been used quite frequently before then. Back in that day, computers were really big and they were really hot. So they often attracted flies and moths that would cause the machines to malfunction. So even though this team didn't coin the term, this particular incident is what caused that widespread usage and popularity of the term bug, which ultimately led rise to the term debugging as well. And since then, a couple of people have criticized the term bug because it distances the developers from blame. It implies that it was something other than developer error that caused the program to malfunction. So some computer scientists have offered up a couple of alternatives, like defect, and my favorite, blunder. Neither of them really took off, although I would love to see us create blunder reports. I think that would be hilarious. So I think bug is pretty much here to stay. Okay, so that's one of the most concrete examples of an origin story that we have for a term that we're using in programming. Other words are a little bit hazier, or it's a little bit more difficult to track down concrete origins of where they came from. But they still have really interesting theories behind them and interesting metaphors that we can pull out of them. One of my favorite examples of these terms is throw and catch. So when you're programming, maybe you have some try-catch blocks, and you're going to throw an exception that is going to be caught, okay? So the first appearance of these terms in programming were introduced in Mac Lisp, which is a dialect of the Lisp language, in 1972. So they introduced two new error handling primitives, which were throw and catch. The lead developers working on this language at the time were American. And in America, the sport of baseball is really popular. I know it's not very widespread elsewhere, probably because it's incredibly boring. But It offers some potential insight into an explanation for these particular terms. So in baseball, a player can commit what's actually called a throwing error. So a player might throw the ball just slightly out of reach for their teammates, or the ball might take an unexpected bounce, or maybe it hits a teammate or a base. Any number of things could go wrong there. But ultimately, the goal for each one of these throws is to catch that ball, to reduce the amount of damage that that error is actually going to do, right? So we have the same concept in programming, where we want to catch any exceptions that are thrown and surface those errors as soon as possible and provide as much information about what went wrong so that our programs don't fail in these really catastrophic ways, okay? So that's an example of one of the theories that is not completely set in stone, a little bit more speculative, but still offers us a metaphor on how to think about these terms that we work with every day, okay? Let's talk about Fubar a little bit. How many people use these metasyntactic variables? Fubar Bass? Okay, me too. I used to, and I stopped recently, and I'll get into that in a little bit. People understand why? Yep. Okay, so Fubar was first used in programming by MIT's Tech Model Railroad Club, and this club was essentially a bunch of nerds or kids playing with model train sets, right? They built this complex system for automating train sets. And these systems had a bunch of kill switches where you would trigger one of these if something terrible was going to happen, something catastrophic was happening. So maybe one of the trains was going to crash into another train or some other obstruction. And they had this little dashboard alongside their system that usually showed like a counter or a clock, something of that sort. But whenever one of these kill switches was engaged, the dashboard instead flashed the word foo. Okay? So think about how foo was being used here to represent and denote that something terrible happened. Okay? So this leads us into the origin of where Fubar came from. As an instructor, I do a lot of demonstrative coding and whiteboarding for my students, and I was using Fubar for a while until one of my students, who was a veteran, was explaining that Fubar was actually a military slang term that stood for messed up beyond all recognition, right? So people would use this term talking about the missions that they were on, often sometimes the severity of the injuries that soldiers sustained, right? And in the tech world, we decided to try to soften the definition of this acronym, and we were like, oh, it doesn't stand for that. It actually stands for fouled up beyond all repair for our software. And we changed the spelling a little bit, but we still maintained that phonetic composition that we have with this term, right? So even though we're trying to soften the way that we use these terms or make them a little bit more gentle, those original conceptions are still there, right? And this term could still be very triggering for certain people. And the software engineering community has no lack of terms with negative connotations to them. Think about the terms master, slave. We have done a pretty decent job of trying to get that out of our vocabulary, but it wasn't always very easy. In 2003, the city of Los Angeles, or County of Los Angeles, had filed a request that manufacturers stop using those terms in their products. And the tech industry, being the tech industry, was all like, no, we want to keep our terms master slave, like don't tell us what to do, and they got really angry about it. So Los Angeles was kind of like, oh, sorry, never mind, it was just a request, and kind of backed off. But the following year, the Global Language Monitor decided to name master slave as the most politically incorrect term of 2004, which was a really great response to that incident, I thought. Whitelist, blacklist, I had another scenario in class one day where one of my students saw some documentation on MDN that used a variable called whitelist. And they were trying to rework some of the code in that example, but they were putting things that should be blocked into this whitelist array. And as I was trying to explain to him what it meant, I was like, oh, well, think about the difference between a whitelist and a blacklist. And I kind of stopped myself short, realizing how negative those terms are and the modern day connotations that those have nowadays. So the origin of those terms, for anyone that might not be following, those terms imply that anything that is white is good and anything that is black is bad, right? And there's a lot of different reasons for the origins of those terms. And maybe perhaps when they came around, they weren't necessarily racist or they didn't hold the connotations that they do today. But because they hold those connotations today, they should definitely be removed from our vernacular as well, from our vocabulary, okay? I'm going on tangents here, so let me get back to a couple other words. Thunks, okay? So thunks are subroutines used to inject additional logic or calculations into other subroutines. So I teach React and Redux at Turing, and this is where we introduce our students to Thunks. They use Redux Thunk for some of their actions, asynchronous actions that they're creating. And they're always like, what on earth is a thunk? I have no idea. And a lot of people think this term originated because of a sound. They think very clearly about a sound that would be occurring from this. So maybe it was the sound of data hitting some kind of information hitting the stack, or data hitting an accumulator. That's what a lot of people reference this term to. But the origin is actually from a very late night of programming years ago, where a couple of developers were thinking really hard about how they needed this type of argument at a certain point in execution of their program, and they didn't have that value right away, but they realized that they could get that information in advance by adding a couple extra calculations at compile time. And in their minds, they thought, okay, if we add these calculations ahead of time, now this variable, this value, has already been thought of. It's already been thought about. Hence, thunk is the past tense version of think, or past tense of think. So that's what that term actually means here. It was a very late night of programming for them. So if you think really hard about it, eventually it will make sense. Okay? Shell. This was a fun one to research. So the analogy here, the metaphor here, is actually quite simple. It is literally just a nut. So the shell, what we think about as our command line or our terminal, what we're actually interacting with is our shell. And we are interacting with this shell rather than the kernel or the central core of our operating system, right? So nuts work the same exact way. Nuts have, they're a fruit, and they have this very hard external shell that does not allow you access to that inner seed or that inner kernel, right? So that's the metaphor there. When I was researching this one, there were a lot of threads where people were getting very philosophical about things and really deep about what it could possibly mean. They were like, oh, the shell is like a seashell from the ocean, and there's this concept of listeners, and you can listen to the ocean just like when you put a seashell up to your ear. And people were just making up these very convoluted metaphors. And then finally someone commented and was just like, listen, it's just a nut. Like, that's all it is. And the conversation stopped after he mentioned that. So we have a tendency to overthink things for sure when we try to come up with metaphors and examples of what things might mean. Okay? So that's just a handful of words that I have picked out from a very long list. If you're interested in learning more words and learning more terminology, there's a book called The New Hacker's Dictionary, which isn't actually quite new anymore. It's actually pretty dated. I think it was around 1996 when it was being actively updated. But there's a lot of other terms in that dictionary that are pretty humorous, like wugga wugga, barfulation, nasal demons. So these are all considered hacker programmer terms. I don't know what any of them mean, but I got a good laugh as I was looking through that glossary, reading some of these terms. But at the same time, alongside these more humorous and more interesting terms in this dictionary, there's also a lot of really upsetting words. Words that very clearly indicate some of the cultural issues that we are still dealing with today in programming. Words like tits on a keyboard, tar and feather, rape. These are all considered programming terms according to that dictionary, right? In the beginning of that book, they say all human cultures use slang in this threefold way: as a tool of communication, and of inclusion, and of exclusion. I want to take the last part of this talk to talk a little bit about this exclusion piece. One of the ways in which the language that we use in programming is the most exclusionary lies in how biased it is towards native English speakers, how much it favors native English speakers. I had a student recently who was a perfectly talented developer. She was very able to write all of the code and build all of the applications, but where she felt she was falling behind as a native Spanish speaker was that grasping that articulation piece. So talking about the code and listening to others speak about it. The terms and metaphors that we use that might make perfect sense to you might be absolutely meaningless to someone else. There was a discussion on a GitHub thread recently where a developer was discussing how the terms property and attribute translate to the exact same word in Chinese, even though they mean slightly different things when we talk about them in English. So their solution here to overcome this was to prefix that word with either DOM when they were talking about a DOM property, or HTML when they're talking about an HTML attribute. That would help them avoid any confusion that they might have ran into. This was really eye-opening to me, and I wanted to hear more stories, what else was out there, and how are people struggling within this industry dominated by English. So I interviewed a couple of developers, and I surveyed about 30, which is still a pretty small sample set, but I was surveying some non-native English speakers just about some of their experiences being engineers, being developers, and working in this technical space that is so biased towards English speakers. So one of the main themes that came up was that there was a longer learning curve for these developers. So not only were they trying to learn the programming language, at the same time, they were trying to learn the written and spoken language that explained it in the first place. Sometimes there were no translations for certain terms that we use in programming. Sometimes there would be a translation, but maybe it would cause even more confusion if that translation wasn't a perfect one-to-one correlation with the original term. Anna Bialas, a developer at the New York Times and native Polish speaker, said, "I have no idea what Polish people call a variable in Polish. Not knowing the words in my native language definitely adds some sense of artificiality to the programming terms. So it's very difficult to derive meaning from terms that seem like they are made up, terms that you have not recognized in your native language, right?" Another theme I noticed was that people had difficulty getting help, also recognizing when they actually needed help. So some people mentioned that it was challenging to find the right search terms to use when tackling a bug that they were encountering. I know I still have problems with that as a native English speaker, so there's an added layer of complexity there for some people. A lot of people mentioned reading issue threads and pull requests wasn't worth it because there was too much slang involved in those threads that convoluted the discussion and made it really difficult for them to follow. The developer I was just talking about, Anna, was also mentioning that when she would read documentation, she would have to double check with her coworkers, do I not understand this because it's poorly written? Or do I not understand this because of a gap in my English proficiency, right? So this was another check that people had to do for themselves in order to understand whether or not it was them or something that was pre-written poorly. We all know how much documentation is written poorly out there and how many bad resources there are out there. So I can't imagine having that additional challenge. Okay. By far, one of the biggest barriers for people seemed to be community involvement and the judgment that came along with that. So I think everyone here can agree that community involvement is so essential for your growth and your learning and enjoyment and success in the industry, right, in your career. And it's such a vital part of being involved in this industry that it's a shame that people start to feel left out of it. Some people mentioned that they would have a hard time following a technical conversation, not because they weren't skilled enough or because they didn't have the technical knowledge, but simply because it would be a large group of people talking very fast about a particular topic, and that made it challenging for them to follow along, which made it look as if they didn't know what people were talking about. My friend Belen mentioned that she produces materials in English, like screencasts and articles and talks, and sometimes people will question her materials or her technical prowess, her skill set, because of a spelling or grammar mistake or her accent. Very simple things. And there's this added layer of having to prove yourself now if you have this barrier that most of us are unfamiliar with, right? So a lot of people did say some positive things about their community involvement, but overall the tone felt kind of lonely. And I think this is something that we should definitely be working on as an industry. And based on some of the responses that I was getting, there were definitely some things that stood out to me that we could start doing and things that people mentioned. So one of those was, when you're creating resources, try to use more illustrations and charts and graphs. Those are more universal and often help clarify things where written text falls short. Lynn Clark got a really great shout out from one of the respondents for all of the work that she's been doing there. So if we could all make an effort to do something more like that, I think that would be super helpful. Limiting the slang that we use in issues and PR threads. If we can aim for words that might be translated more easily in other languages, it might feel silly at first, it might feel robotic at first, but it would help break down some barriers for certain developers that I think would be super helpful. And then lastly, we need to be working with native speakers of other languages to create these resources, to create better resources, more universal resources. And I'm not exactly sure just what this looks like yet, but I'm hoping to collect more data and more experiences so that we can figure that out. So I'm sure a lot of people here have dealt with some of these issues. They've experienced these things. I would love to hear from all of you if you have. I plan on keeping my survey open indefinitely so that people can continue to respond to it. So I'll tweet that out in a little bit. But any experiences that you have, anything that you think that we can be doing to alleviate some of these difficulties that we're causing for other developers, I would love to talk with you more about that, okay? Feel free to find me during the breaks or after all of the talks will be around today. If you have any insights or experiences you want to share, or maybe even some other terms and origin stories that you find really interesting, I'd love to hear about them. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.